Hello, and welcome to the Drachnik and Friends official podcast. I'm Alan, also known as Drachnik, and for today's pilot episode, I'm going to be talking to Saren, the producer at Drachnik and Friends, about her experiences in game development, her time with Drachnik, and more. Saren, how are you doing?
Doing pretty well. Excited to get the podcast off the ground.
Yeah, thank you. So can you introduce yourself with your name, pronouns, and some of the games you've worked on?
Yeah, like I said, I'm Syrenne McNulty. My pronouns are she, her. I have worked on everything Drachnik has done since a Monsters Expedition. I've worked on games like Escape Academy and Manifold Garden and Beastbreaker and Art of Rally and Garbage Pail Kids NES and Star Stuff and Snakebird Complete and a whole bunch of other stuff just over the last, I don't know, 12 years, 11 years, something like that.
Mm-hmm. And how did you get into it initially?
So in 2007, I started covering games, largely in a freelance capacity, reviewing games, working with different PR companies, pitching to different outlets, found some stable work there. And then I started kind of game jamming myself around 2012 because I was the console generation at that point was just kind of changing over away from the 360 PS3 generation into the PS4 Xbox One generation. The Wii U was coming out, and I was very much taking stock of where I was at, and I felt like I had a blind spot in like the creative process of how games are made and like the production process and all of that. And so I started game jamming and just trying to experiment with a bunch of different stuff, trying my hand at coding, trying my hand at game design, trying my hand at production. And around this time, I mentioned the Wii U was coming out. The Wii U was flopping, like really dramatically. And so Nintendo, in a panic, opened up Wii U development to first-time game developers. This is right around the time that Unity, this is 2012, 2013. This is right around the time that Unity is really proliferating in the indie scene. And so they basically open up a program for Unity and HTML5 developers to...
I was going to say, one of the things I remember about Wii U development is, yeah, they had this weird JavaScript framework for games.
Yes.
Did you experience this firsthand?
Yes, I sure did. I built a game in it, and I shipped a game in it. Anyways, they were aggressively trying to expand into being developer-friendly because they were desperately trying to expand into having a video game that people can buy. Look up the Wii U launch, everyone. It was a disaster. So, kind of on a whim, I applied, mostly because I thought it would be a great goof, and I didn't think it would go anywhere. And then, like, a month later, they said, yeah, okay, you meet our bar of standards? Sure. And I was like, what do you mean, sure?
Congrats.
Yeah.
You're a real developer now. Nintendo says so. And like, what was your experience at this point? What had you been doing? What did you show to Nintendo
Nothing.
that filled them with such confidence?
Nothing.
Like, but you'd be making game jams.
Yes, but I didn't show them anything.
Okay, sure. Wow, amazing.
It's like, what have you worked on? Game reviews. What are you
Wait, so you had been making games, but you didn't even mention that to Nintendo.
Yeah, there was nothing to show.
Well,
it was literally like half-finished prototypes of generic game templates. And so Nintendo lets me in.
Amazing.
And this is funny because I literally don't think you know any part of this story.
No, I know none of this, which is great podcast content.
Yes, so I get in. And very quickly, I'm like, well, I should probably take this more seriously, huh? It's like, the bit is all well and good until suddenly someone calls you on your bluff. And I very much could have just sat there and not done anything with it. But I'm like, well, this is a very specific opportunity. I should make the most of it. And if it goes nowhere, it goes nowhere. And so I wanted to kind of expand on one of the templates that I had built myself, but I really also wanted the opportunity to sort of challenge myself to do at least one interesting thing with the template. It was like, okay, if I don't want to make just a generic block push or Sokoban. I want to do something more interesting. I like something like that. And so the project that I ended up kind of seeing through a bit more was a runner because, again, well, it was something that felt very achievable for a first time. And so what I ended up trying to do instead, kind of the twist was I took a I basically made an auto-completing AI because the runner was procedurally generated. And like originally, I was just trying to cheat it. And so I was like, well, how can I do this with the least amount of work? And so I basically set in a range of like minimum height, maximum height for like platforms to spawn in and like all this other stuff. And I ended up in situations that were legitimately uncompletable. And I was like, well, that's not fun for me. So that sure as hell won't be fun for any player. And so what I ended up doing was I ended up making a computer-controlled player 3 screens to the right off screen that is completing things as they spawn in.
Nice.
And if they fail, it deletes it and recreates a prefab, like a guaranteed one, so that it's always completable. And I was like, okay, that feels like an interesting challenge that I made for myself. I took that. I made 2 other variations, one where you have a double jump and one where there's pickups everywhere that will either speed up the whole game or slow down the whole game to make things more challenging. Worked through that, launched that commercially. Again, like went from prototyping to I'll flesh out one of these prototypes, sell it for $2, to oh, now the real part of calling my bluff is I have to learn how to ship a game on console, something that very few indies had done at this point. This is before like Xbox and PlayStation had pushed to make moves into working with small teams. So the amount of indie games that were actually on these platforms were very, very, very small. So a very different era of the industry. And so I was just like, okay, I'll figure this out. And it turned out that was my favorite part. That was the part I was best at, was not putting the game together, not programming it. I hated the programming.
But you enjoyed the process of taking something and getting it to ship.
Yes, and figuring out, I didn't have a whiteboard at the time, so a friend gave me literally just basically a giant piece of wrapping paper that I taped up against the wall so that I could write on. And I just wrote out a list of everything I needed to do from where I was in the project to the game is available for purchase. And I just made that checklist. I wrote estimated times. I was way off. I got the process right. I got the timing wrong. But I figured that out, and I kept adjusting that and working with that. And then I had shipped a game. And by the time once you ship a game on console, and very few people had actually done that, suddenly other companies are taking notice. So quickly sign on as a PS4 and Xbox developer. And I never actually self-published anything on those platforms, but having the knowledge required to ship as well as the materials like hardware
right, so
and stuff.
You didn't ship anything on those platforms, but were you going through the steps of like learning the systems and learning the APIs?
Yes. I was learning the systems and I had hardware, which meant that I was able to contract my services out to other developers, as not only do I know how to ship on PlayStation, I can help you test your PlayStation build, which is rarefied air in the indie space, especially at this time. Again, this was a very right place, right time for me to develop that exact skill set. And so also somewhere in here, I really decided I hated programming so the Wii U game was written in HTML5, and there was I can talk about this because they've talked about it publicly. They had a internally developed middleware called the Nintendo Web Framework that was essentially HTML5 to C++ wrapper exclusively for Wii U. And that was a weird experience, but it worked. Long story short, I ended up shipping a revised / like significantly overhauled version of that runner game on 3DS, which does not have enough anything to do that. It has 64 megs of RAM, I believe.
And so was that also a web framework for the 3DS?
No! And Unity didn't work for the 3DS, so that was C++.
And you were coding that?
Yeah, I had help, but yeah.
Fun times.
180 frames per second.
I mean, that's more than you need.
60 for the left eye, 60 for the right eye, and 60 for the bottom screen.
That's excessive, but okay.
It's very funny because when I called Nintendo out for this, they said, well, the device wasn't designed to do that.
Wait, so what was the device designed to do? 30?
Yeah, 30 basically. Like, it had a refresh rate of up to 60, but they were like, surely no one will, or at least not in 3D, because again, you're like when you're rendering it in 2D.
Sure.
Not to get too boring into the technical details of the 3DS, but when you're in 2D mode, the top screen is displaying one viewport. And as soon as you enable 3D, suddenly it's displaying two viewports on the top screen at the same time and a viewport on the bottom screen. So you basically have three cameras in your project.
Mm-hmm. So for somebody who was realizing that they don't like programming, what was it that pushed you to try and push the 3DS to these extents? Or was it that the process of doing that made you realize, oh, I'm not enjoying this?
It was more... I knew before I was doing it that I didn't enjoy this. Again, like I said, I had help, thankfully. There was a developer in Austria that helped with a lot of it and like with engine stuff, and that was very helpful. But the other thing was I wanted to shut someone up.
A powerful motivator.
That was spite and pride. So that is the honest answer, and I will admit that to you a decade later. But I did not tell anyone that for a while, that was the actual reason. Except Nintendo, because Nintendo knew immediately why I was doing it, and they called me out for it in an email, being like, you don't have to do this. Literally, this is like... Anyways,
So over the entire course of the 3DS development, was there no official Nintendo games that hit that 60 FPS on all three screens benchmark?
There probably was. I'm sure Mario Kart did. Now that I'm thinking about it.
But yeah, it's quite a feat regardless.
Thank you.
What's the gap here between starting to cover games to starting to do game jams to doing the Wii U stuff to the PS4 and Xbox to the 3DS? How much time is elapsing in that period?
So covering games starts at 2007. That doesn't actually stop for a while. I'm still doing game jams and like releasing stuff because it's very much like the releasing games thing is a hobby for me for a while. Even when there's a commercial release, like this, it's not what I'm considering what I'm doing full time. So I go from the game jams start in 2012. Wii U development starts in 2013. Both the Wii U and 3DS versions ship in 2014. I believe anyone can look this up and fact check me, but I believe top of my head, Wii U version ships in May and the 3DS version ships in November. So very fast turnaround on the 3DS. In terms of like PS4 and Xbox assistance, that basically starts like I think January 2015.
Mm-hmm.
That's right after, and that pretty much catapults me into the rest of my entire career. Is I work with a local developer, Flipfly, who made a game called Race the Sun. Friends of mine, very great people, and I work with them on some versions of Race the Sun, but also they work on a game that they're helping another developer with called Absolute Drift Zen Edition, made by Fun Selector. And then Aaron from Flipfly recommends me over to Lars from Level Up Labs, who has me on contract to help with the PS4, Vita, and Xbox One versions of Defender's Quest. That ends up taking about 7, maybe 8 months, as that ends up being a lot more full-time than I expect, but that is also because there's some like major tech stack changes coming with that, and that is much more involved than just release management and testing. That is like basically guiding him through the console version development. And then he starts recommending me to people. I start getting more work. I end up, off of the reputation of helping Defender's Quest, I end up working with William Shear on Manifold Garden. Off of working with William Shear, I start working with Steve Swink on an unreleased project called Scale.
And my impression is that, like, during this period, 2015 to 2020,
Yeah.
you're often not on like one project specifically, but you're just juggling a bunch of projects.
Yeah, I'm really kind of taking availability. Like, there's a lot of projects I've worked on. I've worked on Ooblets. I've worked on 20XX or 20XDX, I think is the official pronunciation. I've worked on, like, there's just a lot of projects that I touch in, like, weird and different capacities, and I'm not even credited on all of them. But like a lot of like, hey, do you have 2 weeks right now? And me thinking, yeah, sure. I can do a 2 week commitment. I have the bandwidth, and then this is actually like helping me support family. So I will do this. So I end up with this very disproportionate resume size.
Yeah, and like, what interested you about working on larger games? Was it just like, oh, this is the work I can get, or like, did you think about like, oh, maybe I should go and find like a really stable job somewhere, or like, yeah, how was your thinking on that,
I mean,
or did it just happen?
a lot of it was like momentum. So with Lars and Defender's Quest, that was, I didn't exactly know that what the project scope of that was going to be when I started. That is not to say I regret anything, but that is like that sort of just built from the momentum. Around this time, I was like looking forward to Manifold Garden as a fan, so I've been following William Cheer on social media, and he put out a tweet asking, it was like an innocuous tweet asking if there was such a thing as like a proofreader for video games that could come in and tell him, or like an editor that could tell him basically, hey, this part's not good, this part is. And I basically just responded being like, yeah, I know some people, here's some names. And then he's in my DMs like 3 minutes later saying, wait, are you the Saren that worked with Lars? I've been meaning to reach out to you. And I was like, okay, this is weird. And so I started working on that game. And then I was the person who was working on Manifold Garden. And so that parlayed me into other things. And I've also just been very fortunate that a lot of the indie scene, talks to each other. And so when I get a sort of, when people feel like I do a good job, they tend to recommend me to other people, which means that I, for a while there, was getting a really consistent influx of work requests. And for that first year, I was taking it on everyone that would ask. And then I started to get a little bit more picky choosy about like, I really don't want to work on this kind of game. And then for a while, 2021, mid 2021, I was like, all right, I'm done taking on new clients, haha. And then a couple new clients came at the same time that I was too excited to work with to say no, because I'm like, oh, but I want to work with you. And so ended up playing myself a little bit on that, but so it goes.
Cool. And then I want to ask about your history with puzzle games.
Mm-hmm.
Like, actually, earlier you said something about like how when you were making a game for the Wii U, you said you didn't want to just make a generic block pusher. Were you playing generic block pushers at the time? Like, is that the kind of thought that would have crossed your head? Like, and
Yeah.
obviously you worked on Manifold Garden, but yeah, what's your history of puzzle games?
I mean, my history of puzzle game, this is going to sound very generic. My history of puzzle games, I mean, it starts with Tetris.
Okay, I mean that's an arcade game rather than a puzzle game, but we'll gloss over that. That's an official Dracnic position on Tetris, but
No, it's a puzzle game. It's just not the subgenre that we work in. So, I mean, I had also like growing up had done a lot of logic puzzle books, a lot of deductive and inductive reasoning. The classics like the person in the red shirt must be seated next to the person in the green shirt, but far away from the person in the blue shirt. The person in the blue shirt got in a fight with like whatever, like all of that kind of stuff, and a lot of stuff that had sort of wired my brain to think this way. Also relevant, my mom was a math teacher
sure, yeah.
and was teaching me high school and college level math in while I was in elementary school, which that's a whole other thing. And so at first I get into a lot of puzzle games not inherently by seeking them out, but by finding them in the context of other games, right? Like Pokemon has a lot of Sokoban sections, or when I play Animal Crossing, I can play Wario's Woods inside of it, or there's like a lot of different contexts for this. I really start getting into playing bespoke puzzle games, like the kinds of games that we work on, around probably around 2004 with like Flash and some stuff on Newgrounds and Congregate. Then in the next couple of years, as like Xbox Live rolled out, PlayStation Network had its digital games with games like Echo Chrome. WiiWare had games like World of Goo. A lot of stuff that kind of kept me coming back to that. Again, this is not inherently the genre that I growing up aspired, like, this is my favorite genre. This is the genre, if I work in games, I will like hardcore work in puzzle games one day. I kind of just found myself in that. It makes sense with how I was raised and the way my brain works. But yeah, and then in terms of working on games, one of those early Game Jam projects I was working on was a half-finished Sokoban. It was literally nothing special. Again, that was just to teach myself some very, very basic fundamentals of things like players interacting with objects and then objects responding to movement of the player character, which is handled by the player controller. But yeah, and then I kind of just fell into it with another game I didn't mention. Flip Fly worked on a game called Evergarden.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
Criminally underplayed for how much fun that game is. And then, yes, from there into Manifold Garden. And once you're into Manifold Garden, it's very easy to get typecast, it turns out.
Mm-hmm.
Especially when you start working at Drachnek, it becomes basically your typecasting.
Yeah. And so you're saying you enjoyed puzzle games. How do you find working on puzzle games versus playing puzzle games?
I think it's a very different mindset. So when I'm working on puzzle games, so as a producer working on puzzle games, it really kind of very early on taught me about mechanic lock versus content lock. Because in my head, prior to this point, I had been very focused on content lock as a part in the game development process where it's not pencils down, but it is essentially like, all right, no new levels, no new areas, no new whatever. We're going to take what we have, polish it up, and then debug, and then start the release process. In terms of like puzzle games, you really need to have mechanic lock a whole lot earlier, otherwise Alan will come in and say, but we haven't fleshed out and explored all of these mechanics yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's actually an interesting thing. Like with puzzle games, I feel like a lot of the time, like, yeah, you need the systems to be done, you need the bugs to be weeded out, but for some puzzle games, it is possible to add levels and iterate on levels very late into the process. I mean, later than you, a producer, is very comfortable with, just because if the core systems are working and like are reliable and are stress tested, the cost of editing this one level to make it a better level is, oh, now you need to make sure that that level is still completable, that you didn't break something at the last minute. But
exactly,
it's something that I as a designer like really appreciate. Is like, I've never let myself make a game where like, oh, the level design affects the art, so you can't make a level change without needing to go through this entire iteration pipeline of sending it back to the artist, and that could take weeks, and then you've got to implement it back into the game, and that's some work. Because as a designer, I'm like, no, I need to be able to edit things when I do a playtest and I see, oh, this thing is bad and it could be good.
Yeah. And so that is a very different, and that's a thing that is a lot more centered on puzzle game production than a lot of other game production. And so that's like just one of the quirks that I had picked up through that process. The other thing is when I, and you know, sorry to everyone for anyone whose illusion I'm bursting here, I will say when I'm playing a puzzle game, I am so much more patient with very difficult puzzles because I can sit there and I can have the intended experience. I'm not about to sit here and say that I'm not going to delay the game because when I'm trying to test the game before release, I can't solve the last puzzles. I'm just going to basically demand to see the answer key because I need to work and it's a job and I didn't make the puzzles. And frankly, it's not entirely my job to know all the solutions to all the puzzles or to figure them out off the top of my head. My job is a lot more about running through the contents of the game, making sure that it all works, especially on different platforms, verifying that you can get a complete playthrough, verifying that a patch didn't break fundamental mechanics. So that is probably the biggest way that being a player and being a producer significantly differ. Is if I'm playing someone else's game, I can just sit there for an hour on one puzzle, have the eureka moment, and then be delighted and move on.
And is there anything you've worked on that you do particularly wish that you could have had a fresh experience playing it?
It's a good question. Honestly, Sokoban Express. I think Sokoban Express, and that's a different one, because Sokoban Express was so much iteration over those years. For people who don't know, Sokoban Express was published by DirectX and Friends, developed by Jose Hernandez in Venezuela. It took about 3 years to make, and we were getting builds, 3 years ago, towards the start of the process, and a lot of the design ethos and design philosophy was consistent through all of it, especially because we picked it up from Subatomic Wire, which was a free game that he had made earlier. But I do think I am kind of jealous of people that get to sit down with that full and final version, especially because the version that shipped is fundamentally better at allowing the player to quickly make a mistake and react to it than some of the versions that, we didn't ship, right? We
spent a lot of time iterating on what UI features would be useful to communicate state about the game.
Exactly. And we shipped the good version of the game. We did not ship the versions that were less good. And because so much of my experience with that game ended up with the versions of the game that were much less communicative, I am kind of jealous of people that get to play the final version of the game for the first time, because it's a great experience. It's a fantastic game and it communicates things so elegantly and so well that I just wish had been communicated to me 2.5 years when I was solving these puzzles.
Actually, on a related note, how do you feel about the final art we shipped with that game, Saren?
This is a gotcha question.
I'm just curious.
I like it. It stands out on store carousels, and it manages to be cartoony while retaining some of the feel of the original game. You're not going to get me.
No, just art is one of the things that we tweaked fairly late into development. We did a complete art overhaul, which Syrenne didn't feel was necessary. I felt was overall a worthwhile change. And
it's good art. The art. I'm not saying that we went from good art to bad art. The new art is good. I just also, I don't know. I'm nostalgic for Sokoban, man. I played that game before I knew you. That shipping with that art style, I think it would have been totally fine, but so it goes.
And overall, what feels like your favorite part of working on a project? What's your least favorite?
My favorite part, if I'm on the project for long enough, I almost always get to see this. Sometimes when I was freelancing, I would literally only come in for the last 2 weeks of a project. I would just basically be a closer of hey, we have a release date that we need to hit. Please help. And so this part had already long since gone. But kind of the moment where people internally feel like they've nailed it. Like, when people feel like, oh, yeah, this is it. This is what we were trying to make. This is what's been in my head this whole time that I've like been trying to get onto the page, or in this case, onto the screen. It works. This is exactly what I wanted. And then from there, being able to sort of expand and polish it up and kind of once you hit that part in the creative process, the rest largely snowballs in terms of like how fast things develop after that. And so I'm very, very excited whenever I get to see that. I'm even more excited when something I do either directly or indirectly helps lead to that moment. But that kind of is a moment that usually happens on projects, and players just don't get to see that. But it's like one of the most special moments, and it's never at the same point in every game. Sometimes it's unpredictable when it'll happen, but when it does, that really makes the whole thing feel worthwhile.
Cool. And finally, what have you been playing recently?
In terms of thinky games, I've been playing World of Goo 2 and Arranger. I have also been playing SteamWorld Heist 2, which is it's not a puzzle game, but it's a thinky game. And that is a game that that is a dangerous game, which is a subgenre of game in my head of don't play this if you need to go to bed in the next couple hours, because you will stay up, and then when you stop playing, it will dominate your thoughts. That game just understands game progression and like core gameplay loops so well. Really loving that.
I like the term "dangerous game." In my head, it's like a slightly different type of game to the kind of thing that I call a time sink game.
Yes.
Like a time sink game is a game that you'll put a lot of time into over like a long period of time, whereas a dangerous game is a game you'll put a lot of time into in a short period of time.
Yes, and when you're not playing it, you're thinking about it, because you just want to get back in there and do another level, solve another puzzle, do another encounter.
No. Thinking about a game when you're not playing it, that's just a good game.
That's not always true.
Sometimes.
In terms of non-thinky games, I am continuing to play Final Fantasy XIV online. This is my sort of... I don't know how to phrase this other than this is my could a depressed person do this type of game. And I've also been playing through, I'm almost done with the English version of The Legend of Heroes Trails Through Daybreak, which The Legend of Heroes Trails is my favorite video game franchise. So very excited on that one. But yeah, that's what I've been up to recently. I'm sure that will change. I play through games distressingly fast, as some people have called out. So we'll see what I'm playing in a couple weeks.
Cool. And anything you're looking forward to in the near future?
Yes, I look forward to things to the point where I have a separate calendar in like on my calendar app for new game releases that I'm particularly excited by. So I will say that the big games over the next month that I'm excited about, as of the time we record this, Star Wars Outlaws, Astrobot, UFO 50, and Zelda Echoes of Wisdom. In terms of what are some other kind of thinky games I'm very excited for, Tactical Breach Wizards comes out tomorrow at the time of recording. I am deeply excited for that. I continue to be excited for Lab Rat. I am pretty excited for Wax Heads. I'm excited for Battlesuit Aces. There's just a few of these other thinky games that I'll be there day one. We'll see. I'm excited to play them.
Nice. How many games on average make it to your calendar of looking forward to this?
On average, like 4 games a month. But that number gets really inflated with August and September.
Sure.
And October.
And I guess like a lot of game developers have like the games backlog of like, oh man, I wish I. But do you actually get to most of the things you're excited for?
No, not at all. I prioritize, I triage games. There are a lot of games that I put an hour into, an hour and a half into, and then I feel satisfied with. And sometimes I'll feel very bad, especially if it's a game that like has gotten a lot of positive attention and like a lot of discourse. So like a good example of that is like Balatro. I was excited about Balatro, and then I played it and I was like, this is good. And I think I can move on at this point. Or like Can of Wormholes is one that I know you in particular are really, really fond of. And I had a really good time with it, but I did not feel compelled to finish it. A lot of narrative-driven games that I'm very excited about, those tends to get the priority for me in terms of what I go in and spend a lot of time on, because those are games where the conclusion meaningfully changes the work more often than a lot of other types of like replayable games.
Sure, that makes sense. Like a narrative game can often be like building towards something.
Exactly. And it's like, for example, if you're reading a mystery and then you stop halfway through, it's like, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
But you've missed what it's all building towards.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you for your time.
Yeah.
Where can people find you online? And do you have anything you want to plug for the audience before we go?
Yeah. Do not perceive me.
Too late.
I'm joking. You can find me on Blue Sky at Syrenne.com. That's SYRENNE.com is my handle on Blue Sky. And you can subscribe to this podcast feed that you're listening to right now, the Dracnic and Friends official podcast, where I will be one of your regular co-hosts alongside Alan, so you'll get to hear a lot more of me.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Dracnic and Friends official podcast. Our music is by Priscilla Snow, who you can find at ghoulnoise.bandcamp.com. Our official podcast artwork is by Adam DeGrandis. Please rate and review us on your podcast service of choice, and be sure to tune in next episode for more interesting conversations.